answer the second part first. You see, if you just say we want socialism, nobody will come to you. I mean, let's be very clear. What I see, the demands I am suggesting, I see them as transitional demands in the Leninist sense. Okay. In other words, they are demands which can mobilize people, but on the other hand, they are not demands which in themselves are socialist. In fact, they are very simple social democratic demands, but they represent a departure from the current trajectory. And once that departure is there, there's a dialectics of that departure that would carry you further. So in that sense, my point is to break away from this trajectory. And when you break away from this trajectory, you do so on the basis of mobilizing maximum amount of support. Okay. So I'm suggesting it that in that sense, not because I believe it's possible, of course not. I think even in Latin America, I would defer to better knowledge here. Even in Latin America, look at the amount of intervention that the Maduro government is facing. So imperialism is not going to just leave you like that. Okay. But on the other hand, if you want to mobilize the people, then you don't just call for socialism because there will be nobody behind you, but imperialism will still attack you. So in order to mobilize people, you have to have all kinds of transitional demands. So I see it in that sense. As far as your first point is concerned, no, I think, in 2004, the left support to the Congress, I believe, was absolutely essential. Of course, it's very important to keep these fellows out. I mean, it's very important to keep them out of power. Okay. There is a fundamental difference, between the Congress and the BJP. The Congress is a standard bourgeois party full of corruption, wedded to neoliberal policies, playing with communal politics in all kinds of ways. But you see, there's a difference between playing communal politics on individual cases and actually having Hindu Rashtra as your objective. There is a basic difference. But on the other hand, of course, the Congress, after the left the Congress, UPA too, the Congress actually has become so unpopular. Mind you, when the left supported the Congress, it was not unpopular, otherwise they wouldn't have won the 2009 elections. But the point is, the Congress has become so unpopular that for the left to even talk of supporting the Congress now would have been absolutely absurd and suicidal. I would agree with you there. The Congress may support an alternative government, but I don't think an alternative, either the left directly or the left getting together a group of people to support a Congress government would actually have been a good idea, not at all. Okay. The Maruti thing, what you are saying, they have their independent trade union, but they get the support of the CITU, which is the left affiliated. As a matter of fact, recently I attended one of their I was a member of the jury to which they gave, and so on. We even went and met along with a lot of CPI and CPIM leaders, we went and met the Labour Minister of the previous government. So it's not as if they have rejected the organized left. That's not true, because they are making common cause with them. Even if that might have been the case earlier, that's no longer the case now. When it comes to this West Bengal, you're right, but let's be very clear that within the left, there are two views. Obviously, there is one view influenced greatly by China. Okay, I've seen the organized left for decades now. I think a very important role is played by China. I'm not saying the Chinese consciously do it, but I think emulating the Chinese is something. And generally the argument is the Soviet Union collapsed, so China has not collapsed. China continues to be a socialist country, and it is a socialist country because it has followed all these things which have given it 10% growth and so on. I think this China experience has been a very important factor in influencing substantial sections of left, particularly in West Bengal. Okay. But on the other hand, that's not the overall left position. Not only is it not the theoretically left position, but in Kerala, for instance, we had a very different model. Even during the period 2006 to 2011. I was associated with the Kerala government, and I'm sorry, I'm not trying to, as it were, blow my own trumpet or anything, but we did not invite any corporate group. We said no to lots of corporate groups that had come and demanded land and so on. Whatever land was taken over was done in a way where actually it did not create any mass problems. And on the other hand, it actually did a number of things by way of raising the wages of coir spinners, by health insurance scheme and all kinds of things. So I think the experience of the Kerala LDF government was quite different from the experience in the more recent period of the West Bengal government. Okay, and even in West Bengal, I'm sure there are different views. I mean, I think you're certainly right that the Chief Minister made a statement saying that, you know, we shouldn't have strikes and so on. But on the other hand, he was pulled up for that. So I agree with you that there are two views within the left, but on the other hand, the point is to struggle against the wrong view, not to write off the left, because there are thousands of people who are very committed to the left cause. And it must not also be forgotten that the left, after all, withdrew support from UPA on the basis of the nuclear deal. In other words, rightly or wrongly, I know people like Amartya Sen are very critical of the left on that, but you know, rightly or wrongly, it perceived it as making a compromise with imperialism, and therefore it withdrew support. Now, I think it requires a fair amount of commitment to an anti-imperialist position to be able to do that. And it was heavily criticized, and it's criticized to this day. I've heard Amartya Sen criticizing the left for this, and he is a left voter, certainly. Discuss this vote thing. Mayawati in UP got 4.1% votes. No, I mean, at the national level got 4.1% votes, in UP roughly 1/5, that means close to 20% votes, with 0 seats. So let's not forget that the BJP got, I mean, they only got 31% votes, on the basis of which they got this huge majority. Now, I think the Dalits in UP, by and large, have remained with her. Okay? You'll be surprised to know that what percentage of Muslims you think voted for the BJP? Just, I ask you, just guess. Certainly in UP and Bihar, 2%. In other words, this whole idea that, you know, I mean, the development agenda was so popular that Muslims started voting for BJP, Dalits started voting for BJP, that's not true. On the other hand, you find that, this is based on a sample survey, on the other hand, you find that 90% of the upper castes voted for the BJP, okay, which is a phenomenally high figure. So, the fact that there is, I mean, you know, that's why I was talking about the fact that the exclusion of minorities, the exclusion of Dalits is something which is, as it were, felt by them as well. I do not believe that there was substantial Dalit voting as far as the BJP is concerned. What is called OBC, which is basically intermediate castes, yes, I think quite a few intermediate castes did vote for them. And I think in that sense there is kind of division which is taking place between the Dalits and the very poor, and as it were, the less marginalized OBCs, intermediate castes and so on, and I think they cashed in on that. But even so, they got, after all, 31% votes. 69% voted against them. So, then as far as your other point about corruption is concerned, you know, you see in any government scheme there is a certain amount of corruption, okay? But if there's corruption, the idea is to tackle corruption. But the idea is not to give up the scheme, because nobody, to my mind, has actually, I mean, nobody other than those who are ideologically committed to doing away with the scheme has actually argued, based on field experience, that the benefits of the rural employment guarantee scheme have not accrued to the agricultural and rural workers. I mean, that's just not true, because it has benefited them. Could have benefited them more if there was no corruption. But on the other hand, that's no argument for giving up the scheme. So I would not see corruption as standing in the way of having a kind of massive program of inclusive, you know, I mean, inclusive welfare program based on rights and so on. So if you're talking about inclusive development, in that case, it's possible for you to win back the middle strata but actually create the antagonism vis-a-vis corporate capital, vis-a-vis international finance and so on. Okay. Now, of course, therefore, the case for inclusive development has within it a confrontation with the domestic corporate financial elite as well as with international finance capital. But it is a confrontation. I mean, suppose you suddenly said that, okay, we don't want globalization, we don't want neoliberalism. In that case, you're not developing a base on, a popular mass base for that demand. Inclusive development, the slogan of inclusive development, or even an attempt at inclusive development, is a way of actually developing a popular base, against, as it were, integration into this regime of international finance capital. That's the way I see it. That, in that sense, is transitional. Aam Aadmi Party, Common Man Party, it's you see, it's a party which talked of corruption, did not relate corruption in any way to structures. Okay, they did not relate corruption to structures, not because they did not believe. I mean, some of them, I know many of them. They would be people of the left. Okay, they would personally believe this, but there was this idea that if we do this, we'll be putting people off. Now, I think that's opportunistic. I mean, opportunistic in the bad sense, because the whole idea is to bring is that the people should be exposed to theory. I mean, anything that actually eschews theory in the name of getting people's support is, to my mind, the opposite of what should happen. Okay. And I think they made a very big mistake in giving up the Delhi government, because one opportunity they had of showing that they can make a difference is something which they gave up. If I had been in that party, for instance, private hospitals take government land. They promise that we are going to treat, say 20% of our patients we are going to treat free from the poorer segments. They don't actually do that. Now, suppose you are in Delhi, suppose you're the Chief Minister of Delhi, even for 6 months, you can at least visit 20 hospitals and make sure that they actually, and that itself has a tremendous effect as far as the people are concerned. They did nothing. It was just a cop-out, and which is why I think they really, and now they're apologizing for it, but that was, many people argue, not without substance, that in some sense the corruption discourse that they started is something that played into the hands of the BJP. Okay, then capital control is absolutely basic. I mean, let me, there is no point talking about any alternative agenda unless you visualize capital controls, because capital controls are a prerequisite. In fact, even before you can put in capital control, there can be substantial capital flight. Okay, but and therefore some transitional pains, as far as people are concerned, is something which may be inevitable. But certainly, capital controls are absolutely essential. Okay. The last point, which I think is very difficult to answer, because I myself don't really know. You see, I do find that among the youth now, for whatever reason, the appeal of the left has gone down. Okay. Now you may say, how come the BJP has an appeal? Of course, firstly, they start with children, I mean, all the shakhas of the RSS and so on. But secondly, and more importantly, let's say 15 years ago, the RSS had, Swadeshi Jagran Manch, which was opposed to neoliberal policies. The RSS was actually taking a position opposed to neoliberal policies. Okay, and Swadeshi Jagran Manch enjoyed the support of the RSS top brass. I know, for instance, that during the time that we were having the struggle against the TRIPS agreement, okay, the RSS was actually supporting us. Okay, so within the RSS there was a certain, okay, I'm not saying all RSS, all BJP people, but certainly as far as the RSS is concerned, there was a very strong element of anti-neoliberalism that was there. And I think there withdrawing from that, because now the RSS has put up Modi who's talking about development, which basically means a muscular neoliberalism. So the RSS support for neoliberalism has also therefore meant their, in a sense, inducing a lot of younger people, urban, middle class, educated and so on, to come onto their bandwagon. Now, I think there is no denying that there is a loss of interest as far as the urban, middle class, educated youth is concerned in the left, in communism. And I believe this is an international phenomenon. Okay. The very fact that today, for instance, you look at Bangkok, huge numbers of young people who are actually marching. I have no love lost for Shinawat's sister, but fundamentally, what is the issue on which they are marching? Because she gave some concessions to the peasants. And similarly, you look at Maduro, for instance. The people who are really marching are the urban middle class youth. So I think everywhere there is a kind of distancing of the urban middle class youth from the left cause, which is the very opposite of what was there when I was a student. Because then almost every kind of student who really thought about things was one way or the other sympathetic to the left. One version of the left or another version of the left. But fundamentally that was the case. Why this is the case is difficult. In the case of India, perhaps I would say that this boom we have had is something that has really benefited segments of the urban middle class youth, and those whom it has not benefited, it has certainly aroused hopes among them that they may become beneficiaries of it. Okay. What does the left promise them? The left promises them capital controls, withdrawing from neoliberalism and so on, which may benefit the workers and the peasants, but they do not immediately see that they are going to benefit from it in some ways. Then they see the left as basically dinosaurs, who believe in the old Nehruvian model and so on, and which is something that they don't have much sympathy for. In a sense, one can say that India has never had the kind of economic crisis that Africa or Latin America had. If India had had such a major crisis and the middle class urban youth had actually been squeezed by such a crisis, it may have got radicalized to an extent, I don't know. But I think there is a big, true, even now there is a crisis in the sense of, as I said, inflation, recession and so on, but it's nothing of this on the scale in which in Latin America you had a crisis. And anyway, it's fairly recent, it hasn't had as long an innings. But I think that's a very difficult question, it's worth thinking about. Maybe the left should be far more proactive on issues like environment and so on, which does animate the urban, educated, middle class youth more than property relations and things of that kind. And then move slowly towards issues of capitalism and so on. But the left in that sense perhaps has been too old-fashioned in going on talking about talking in the same language as it used to do earlier. The mainstream media played a fantastic role in presenting the so-called development model and so on. Friends of mine who go for these, there are all these interviews in the evenings with various intellectuals and so on and so forth. Occasionally they would call some left-wing people, and those who go, they would actually force you. But you must admit that Modi has a lot of appeal, but you must admit, so they're all the time forcing you to fall in line, saying that there is a kind of Modi way, there's a kind of Modi this. Asking specifically about the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, I think the CPIM manifesto in the last elections actually opposed the Armed Forces Special Powers Act.
I think it said something about giving it a human face, but not opposing it.
Well, I certainly to start with, Armed Forces Special Powers Act cannot be implemented by the center. Okay, because Farooq Abdullah has, or rather Omar Abdullah has already said we don't want it, so they should not have it. Okay, but fundamentally, shall we say, Armed Forces Special Powers Act as it exists is something which has been opposed by the CPIM recently. Many in the CPIM have been opposing it. Actually, the CPIM manifesto in the more recent period has been quite interesting. It's the first party that came out in favor of gay rights. It came out against the death penalty. It came out, it was opposed, at least in the present form, with the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, and so on, a number of other issues. It has actually been breaking out of the old, because very rarely do you have communist parties supporting gay rights. So, traditional communist parties, Comintern parties. All right, so, but if you're asking me about Tripura, what is happening in Tripura, I think fundamentally there is still a lot of support for the CPIM because they have won both the parliament seats. And I think part of the support arises from the fact that they're actually implementing a lot of the welfare schemes. I should say that, look, Jayalalitha has got 38 out of 39 seats in Tamil Nadu. Why? Because, we don't know why, but first past the post is obviously one very important reason. But the point is that she actually implemented many of these welfare schemes very, very effectively. In Tripura, this is what they have done. Certainly they have, for instance, got an Urban Employment Guarantee Act, which doesn't exist in other states. So I think implementing these kinds of schemes has certainly given them a certain kind of popularity. But on the other hand, I'm also aware of the fact that, it's quite possible. I've seen, for instance, businessmen hovering around ministers in Tripura. I think one of these days there's no track. And if so, then they might go the West Bengal way. But till now, they have not. The way I would put it is the following. Listen, I'm opposed to death penalty. I'm opposed to the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. My point is that to the extent that the left can be pushed into taking good positions, that is what we should be trying. In other words, you see, it seems to me that if you are serious about an alternative politics against imperialism, you have to unite as far as possible the widest segment of progressive opinion. There's no point saying that I am progressive, all the rest are reactionary. Now, if that is the case, then it's very important. That doesn't mean just a formal united front. I agree with you there. But therefore one should actually push the left, if you like. And to be able to push the left, it's also important to, as it were, appreciate whatever good things they're doing. If you're simply hostile to them, they're not pushing them. Then, that would be my attitude.
What about its relationship with Pakistan?
Nawaz Sharif has come. But the point is that, no matter what the relationship with Pakistan, certainly there's going to be hostility vis-a-vis the Muslims. I'm not saying that Modi may instigate riots. Modi did in Gujarat, but he may not do so now. But fundamentally, let me put it this way. If you are a Muslim in Delhi, and you try and rent a house, you would not get one. You would get a house in a Muslim ghetto area, but not in a posh area in Delhi. Therefore, already a kind of ghettoization has taken place. I think the Modi kind of victory strengthens those tendencies. So it's not just a question of what Modi does, it's actually something that strengthens those tendencies. Now, when you're talking about Israel, of course, Israel has been very strongly, I'm told that one of the public relations things he hired was an Israeli firm. I'm not sure, but that's what people say. Very close relations. BJP has always had very close relations with Israel, and of course Modi is going to toe the American line. So I think the US, Israel, India axis is something which is going to get strengthened. And I think the India-Pakistan normalization, if it happens, would happen because of American pressure. Americans did put pressure on the Manmohan Singh government and also in the wake of the Kargil war for a kind of normalization between India and Pakistan. And therefore, it is not a normalization which is from below, it's normalization at the behest of the Americans. That could well happen. I would not exaggerate this, because let's not forget 69% of the people have voted against the BJP. So I would not really exaggerate this. And certainly some of the loss of the left or the Congress is because of the immediate past and so on. I mean, as they were talking about, the Bengal positions and so on have really alienated a lot of people. And all that is true. So it's not as if Congress and the left and so on are finished. Not at all. I mean, I think they have suffered a setback. Depends on how they react to it, how they come out of it, etc. The second thing is that, I mean, I think, if you see, if you look, I mean, the minorities are so kind of apprehensive at this moment. Dalits less so because they have not yet realized, because it has not been an open attack against the Dalits. But the minorities are so apprehensive at this moment that it is very important for the left to say that we are not going to allow your rights of citizenship to be trampled upon. To some extent it's already being trampled upon, but we are not going to allow this, okay? By the way, you're talking about Armed Forces Special Powers Act, the left was opposed to that, all that, TADA and POTA and so on. Is very important to actually increase that opposition. In UP today, for instance, I personally come across this. They can pick up a Muslim youth as a terrorist, keep him in jail for 10 years, and I have actually personally met people who have been in jail for 10 years, keep him in jail for 10 years without any legal defense, because any lawyer that actually supports this person gets beaten up, okay? And the case drags on, no bail, is kept in jail for 10 years, and some of them at the end of it, miraculously, have been released as innocent, but the people who arrested them have not been penalized, punished in any way, and when they are released, they can't get a job, because, the stigma of terrorism still attaches to you, even though you have been exonerated by a court of law. So there are strong elements of fascism still, already. So I think it's very important for the left to, kind of stand firm on all these issues, and that would be the root of revival as well. And you see, okay, let me quote you something which may strike you as very odd. Very well-known communist leader, you might have heard of B.T. Ranadive. B.T. Ranadive used to say that actually in this country, there are not more than 1,000 people who are secular. But that's enough to defend secularism. So you see what I mean. I think that 1,000 may have come down now to 500, but I think still we can defend secularism. Okay, I mean, there is the organized communist movement, which consists of CPI and CPIM, and they have an alliance with two other left parties, Forward Bloc and the RSP, which are small parties. Then you have the kind of left that is outside, the in which various CPI-ML groups would be involved. The Maoists are at one extreme. Then you have a whole lot of people who would belong to, sort of non-political left, who would belong to NGOs of various kinds. Among the NGOs, of course, you have NGOs set up by imperialism, but also some NGOs which are set up by people who are actually quite genuinely interested in radical changes. In the old days, you had the Socialist Party, but the Socialist Party got splintered, and now it's part of Mulayam Singh Yadav's party, or it's part of Lalu Prasad's party. It's in different organizations, including the Aam Aadmi Party. The Aam Aadmi Party also drew quite a lot of. So in that sense, it's not very clear to what extent they remain left. The old Socialist Party had a certain left agenda, though it was very strongly anti-communist and anti-Soviet, but nonetheless, it had a certain left agenda of its own. Now it's far more difficult to put them anywhere, because they are not even a particular group. But I think I would broadly include the NGOs who are left. I would include the organized communist parties and their allies. I would include the communist groups which are not a part of these organized communist parties, but probably don't even participate in parliamentary elections, but in some sense are left. And of course, the Maoists have a different politics altogether.
How influential are they on national politics?
Maoists.
Yeah.
You know, but you know, they don't actually influence national politics in that sense. For instance, immediate issues, and for instance, let's say the Indo-US nuclear deal, it's not as if the Maoists, no matter what their views, they would not intervene on issues of that kind, or issues of, let's say, MGNREGS, I mean this employment guarantee scheme, they would not intervene on those. So therefore, their interventions on issues of immediately which are on the agenda is not much. And I think the Maoists have been losing a certain amount of ground. That is without doubt.
Okay, so I have a question.
If I may say so, the kind of, you know, the weakening of the left is something from which the Maoists are not free. You had two different positions. There was one position which was occupied by, let's say, Manmohan Singh and the finance minister and so on, which was very strongly neoliberal. The other position was occupied by Sonia Gandhi, who wanted some little bits of concessions to be given. I mean, this employment guarantee, right to food and so on. She was in favor of all that. When the election defeat took place, there was an argument put forward within the Congress. Now, those in the Congress who supported this employment guarantee scheme, right to food and so on, did so in the name of a rights-based approach. It was not actually a rights-based approach, because any rights-based approach has to be universal. Okay, it was a targeted, which was a compromise, as it were, with the neoliberals, which is why it didn't break out of the neoliberal mold. But there was a view immediately articulated that it is that which is responsible for our defeat. So that is quite possible that in the Congress there would be one tendency, I mean, why possible? There is one tendency in the Congress to, as it were, mimic Modi. Modi is successful, and if we have to be successful, we have to mimic Modi. The other tendency is to persist with the old approach. Now, my fear is that even though Sonia Gandhi and Rahul Gandhi have been re-elected, they offered to resign and they was re-elected and so on. There's a bit of a drama there. But my feeling is that actually the Congress is likely to withdraw from some of the transfer schemes that it had been committed to earlier. That's my feeling. And in a sense, that's my fear. But on the other hand, many people on the left, which includes NGOs and so on, which had fought very hard for some of these schemes, right to information, right to employment, right to food and so on, are extremely worried that the Modi government is going to withdraw from this. But I think it's very important for them to, together with the left, to actually fight, in which case it's possible that some elements in the Congress might join. The BJP's own position is do away with Article 370. In other words, okay, you know, there are three basic issues on which the Vajpayee government had actually not moved. One was abrogation of Article 370, one was building this Ram temple and so on, and the third was a uniform civil code. Okay. All these three, the uniform civil code basically, as far as they see it, is simply imposing the Hindu code on all the other minorities. It is not actually giving rights to women. Okay, so now there is a pressure that you have got a majority now, you move on all these three. So if they move on abrogating 370, in that case the Kashmir situation will become extremely explosive. Is that India is one of the very few countries in which you still have a live, fairly powerful communist movement. I know it's weakening rapidly. The whole idea in some sense is to really put pressure on it. The way we want it to change, let's just actually put pressure on them to change in that way. But simply abandoning them and allowing them to disintegrate. I must tell you, you know, there was a view which was expressed to me by one of the leaders of the CPI-ML, that in Bengal, if the CPI-M gets destroyed, then the entire left base would come to us. But that's completely wrong. If the CPIM gets destroyed, the left base gets destroyed. So that is why that's what I was trying to say, that, that is very important, that we should of course criticize the left, we should of course put pressure on them to change in directions that we think are good, but on the other hand, you cannot have an antagonistic relationship with the left. Okay. You have to have some connection.
Nobody wants to stop. Yeah, go ahead.
Enormously increased power of corporate capital. Okay, obviously corporate capital is still very powerful, is extremely powerful even now, but that power is going to increase greatly, because I think corporate capital has been involved in funding this man's election, and obviously they're going to demand their cut. Far more reduced transfers as far as the poor are concerned. Okay, much closer ties with US imperialism. I think, and with Israel as well. A greatly increased ghettoization of the Muslims. Even if you do not have, you would have riots of all kinds, you may not have pogroms on the scale of Gujarat. I don't know, it's very difficult to say. But the point is that certainly an increased ghettoization of the Muslims. I think all these, and correspondingly, a greater marginalization of the already marginalized, that is the Dalits. I think these, to my mind, are the features. Call them what you like, but fundamentally they are reminiscent of fascism. Fascism, we always think of Hitler, but okay, I'm not saying in that sense necessarily. I'm not saying it will start a war, but these are the features that you see.
But wouldn't you add to that many more sweatshops, exploitation, casual, because that was what Gujarat has, huge industries which are entirely sweatshop.
Some of these things are already happening, but I think that is going to be accentuated. And of course, an attack on liberal opinion, an attack on progressive opinion, an attack on trade unions and so on, all that is going to happen.
But not the militarization of the labor processes, which isn't in culture.
Difficult, it's very difficult to say. Certainly, I don't see it happening immediately, but maybe over a period of time. Difficult to say.
Of course.
There used to be a thinking in the US State Department that basically that means they, ought to have local powers which are beholden to the US but exercise authority around their neighborhood on behalf of the US. They would like India to be one such local power. Okay, and that's one of the reasons why the US is so keen on India, Pakistan having a kind of good working relationship. So they would like India to be a major power in that area, but beholden to the US, which would suit the BJP, because then they can tell the people, look, what a big power we are dominating all these neighboring countries. So I suspect that model, as opposed to an alternative in which India gets closer to Russia, China, and so on, which, India was always kind of, had that option open, okay? But I think that option might actually get closed. That's my feeling. Samir Amin has this view that actually the US is preparing for a war against Russia and China. I don't know if that's true. That may be an excessive remark to make. But fundamentally, if you see that contradiction accentuating over time, which it is anyway over Ukraine, for instance, with Russia, I think India, which until now at least has an opening to that group, might be forced and might actually voluntarily, under a BJP leadership, fall in line much more with the US. That's my guess.
Okay, so maybe we should finally stop.